Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitcg Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the Irish potato famine in the middle of the 19th century. Through starvation, death, and mass migration out of the country, Ireland's population over the next 50 years was reduced practically from about 8 million people to 4 million people. Many of those leaving Ireland came here to the United States. My guest today argues that the devastating effects of the famine are very much a product of British colonialism and imperial capitalism. My guest is Padraic X. Scanlan. Padraic Scanlan is Associate Professor at the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources at the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto. And he is the author of the book, Rot, an Imperial History of the Irish Famine. Padraic Scanlan, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this program. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
I think most people have heard that there in history was this devastating potato famine in Ireland, but may not know a whole lot more beyond that. So just sort of generally opening up our discussions before we get into details. And the famine itself, seems oftentimes is written to last from between 1845 to 1852. What's important to know in the general story of the potato famine?
Right. So the Irish potato famine was we could talk about what it means for a famine to be caused later, but in the kind of broadest sketches, from 1845 until about 1851. Large swaths of Ireland, of Irish potato fields were struck by epidemics of what's now called late blight, which is a disease caused by a fungus-like organism called Phytophthora infestans, or P. infestans. I'll stick to P. infestans because I'm not even sure I've pronounced his first name that well. And, in the course of those, nearly half decade of potato blight, close to 1 million people in Ireland died either of famine-related causes or from starvation itself. And nearly as many as 2 or 3 million people emigrated. Although it's not entirely clear, there was a census was taken in 1841 and a census was taken in 1851 by the United Kingdom. And they found that the population of Ireland had dropped by nearly 2 million people in the course of that decade, which was really striking because the population in 1851 was lower even than the population had been in 1821. So in the broadest strokes, that was the Irish potato famine, this ecological, political, and demographic catastrophe that struck Ireland in the middle of the 19th century.
And the people who left Ireland during this period of time, and I guess the decades after, right? This has a long effect. This isn't something that's just over in 1854 and now, well, we're glad that's done. This would have long-term effects. Did many people who left come? Did most of them come to the United States? You're in Canada. Did they come to Canada too?
Yeah. So it's pretty straight. So my dad's family, are. I mean, everyone's Catholic, but my dad's family are Irish Catholics, or Irish diaspora Catholics. And so they're, I think great great grandparents on my dad's side, I guess, so wherever there are 8 of them. So they all came to Canada, to Quebec, in the 1850s, not during the famine, but just after. And so you're right. The potato famine sets, Ireland has always been, not always been, nothing has always been anything, but Ireland for a very long time was a country that produced a lot of immigrants to North America and elsewhere. Even in the 18th century, huge numbers of especially Presbyterians from Ulster in the north of Ireland came to what became the United States, to the point where I think something like 17 or 18% of the non-enslaved population of the United States in 1783 were either Irish-born or of Irish descent. But that phenomenon was exacerbated by the famine, and it was a kind of, the pathways that were carved by immigrants in the 18th century were used in part in the 19th century, but the famine set in motion a real mass migration out of Ireland to Australia, to New Zealand, to the United States, and to Canada. And in some ways, right, like my own family history, the Scanlans are like famous, in some ways, famous cowards, right? And it's surprising that, in some ways, like the people who went to traditional, this may be legendary, but right, the idea is like people wanted to go to New York or Boston, but if you ended up in Quebec and you didn't have the means to get to the United States, you ended up staying in places like Quebec City, in Montreal, in the St. Lawrence Valley, right along, kind of running just north of the American border. So that's the famine set in motion mass migration.
Are there many Irish people in North America? Do you know? And I don't mean to get too far off track. My mom's maiden name is Bogan. It used to be O'Bogan, but they dropped the O because of the discrimination at the time against the Irish.
Yeah.
When you have mass influx of migrants coming in, we know that story. Is there a sizable population of Irish in North America?
I think people claim, I think like I have this very Irish first name, but I think of myself really as Canadian rather than of like sort of attenuated Irish descent. And in some ways, this book was a way to work through, in some ways, that questions about my own, not identity, because as I say, I don't identify in quite the same way, but of ancestry, I guess. There are certainly millions of people who claim there are far more people who claim Irish ancestry than there are people in Ireland, by a factor of probably 4 or 5. There are a lot of people in the Irish diaspora, and not that many people in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom.
And the famine is a great driver of this diaspora.
Yeah, I mean, both, and not just, in some ways, like I'm working now on some stuff about the era of industrialization that I kind of spun off from the work I did for Rot. And one of the parts of that project is looking at the arrival of huge numbers of Irish. It's not even really clear to call them, it's not really fair to call them immigrants, because they're all, it would be like if you moved in Canada from Ontario to Manitoba, you wouldn't say like I immigrated to Manitoba, because you're still within the same country. So if you're someone from the Irish countryside and you move to Liverpool in 1840, before the famine, you're not immigrating. You're all within the same country, the same United Kingdom. But hundreds of thousands of people from Ireland moved to British cities as well, and really changed the character of urban life and working class life in Britain's industrial cities, even as millions of immigrants are changing the demographics and the labor relations and the structure of North American cities as well.
And this is an important point, an important part of the story in the 19th century, I guess between 1801 and 1922, to be more precise. All of Ireland is a part of the United Kingdom.
That's right. Yeah. So Ireland is famously, right, it has this complex, long, in some way, like very tense, often very acrimonious, but still weirdly kind of codependent relationship to the island of Britain, right? These two islands, this archipelago in the North Atlantic. So Ireland is first notionally conquered by Anglo-Norman warlords, basically in the 11th and 12th centuries, after the Norman invasion of England changes the structure of the English aristocracy. But Ireland's is claimed by England for a very long time, but the degree to which that claim is enforceable fluctuates depending on the interest, depending on the collaboration of Irish aristocrats, depending on the degree to which the English crown, or later the British crown, wants to assert authority over Ireland. So, there's this kind of up and down, and I'm not an expert on medieval Irish history. And, sometimes historians of medieval Ireland can be extremely contentious. So I don't want to say anything that I'll regret. But by Henry VIII, in the early modern era, wants to establish a more real English presence in Ireland. He declares himself King of Ireland. And in Ireland, and their plantations, although this is the same time, roughly the same time when sugar plantations are being established, worked by enslaved people in the British Caribbean. In this sense, plantation is meant more like a plantation of a forest, right? It's saplings that are scattered in order to grow a forest that'll later be cultivated. And the idea is you can introduce English or Scots settlers to Ireland who will sort of work to make real the notional claims that England makes over Ireland, right? By introducing a settler population, you can make real the Anglicization of Ireland. And the first Munster plantation fails. The most successful one is the one that's the most famous, which is the Ulster plantation, which begins in the era of James I and around that era, and entails the mass migration of tens of thousands of Scots Presbyterians and other British immigrants from from Britain proper into the north of Ireland, and it's one of the reasons why the 6 counties that make up Northern Ireland are still part of the United Kingdom as opposed to the Republic of Ireland. And so the Ulster plantation exists. Sorry, this is a long-winded way to get to it.
I told you at the beginning.
It's important.
I told you before we began to take space. So.
I mean, the problem, the problem, I think the thing in Irish history, at least in the history of Ireland's relationship to Britain, is that everything is old. Like the relationship and the complexity of the relationship has such deep roots that, you might be talking about something proximate, but there's all that weight of history that's weighing down on every kind of dispute. And then in the 17th century is really the break point, and it's the point that I take in Rot to be the beginning of the real colonial more formal quasi-colonial project in Ireland. So after the English Civil Wars in the 1640s, Oliver Cromwell's armies invade Ireland. After the Glorious Revolution in 1688, as it's called in England, William of Orange's armies invade Ireland, and they make real, in a sense, what had always been a claim that England had made over Ireland. And then in the course of the 18th century, Ireland is not colonized. It's not fair to call it a colony of Britain, but I would say that its relationship to Britain is colonial insofar as the Irish are the bulk of the Irish population are Irish Catholics. The British Parliament introduces a series of laws that suppress Catholicism in Ireland. And generally, those laws are not that strictly enforced when it comes to everyday belief and practice. Although priests are sometimes rounded up and sometimes executed, but people, like everyday people, are not usually punished for being Catholic, but they exist. But if you are a Catholic landlord, you lose your land. So they're called the penal laws, and the penal laws that are the most strictly and assiduously enforced are the ones that involve taking away land from the Catholic aristocracy and handing it over to a new, mostly the kind of camp followers and soldiers and descendants of soldiers in those armies, especially William III's army. And so in the course of the 18th century, Ireland becomes this quasi-colony of what's now Great Britain, because in 1707, England and Wales, which had been a single kingdom, and Scotland, which had been a single kingdom, with the same king, right? So King James I was king of England and Wales, and he was also king of Scotland, but the two were two completely separate, like one king, two kingdoms. In 1707, a new polity is created called Great Britain, and Great Britain includes England, Scotland, and Wales, and Britain begins to more systematically extract rent and import goods from Ireland. And that happens throughout the 18th century. Then after the American War of Independence, a kind of general fear of similar Americas breaking out across the British Empire takes place in Ireland. And in the 1780s, the Irish Parliament, which had been basically under the thumb of the British, under the thumb of Britain's Parliament for a very long time under a law called Poyning's Law, which allowed Westminster to basically strike down any piece of legislation that they didn't like coming from the Irish Parliament, and also allowed the British Parliament to even set the parliamentary agenda of the Irish Parliament. That's repealed. Ireland has this brief moment of quasi-independence as an independent parliament under a single crown. And then there's a rebellion concomitant with the Napoleonic Wars in 1798, the United Irish Rebellion. And after the United Irish Rebellion, to get to make a very long story a little bit shorter, in 1800 and 1801, Acts of Union are passed under pressure from Westminster, from London, that effectively dissolve the Irish Parliament, not effectively, literally dissolve the Irish Parliament, and incorporate Ireland into a new polity, the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom only dates to 1801 as a political organism. And under the Acts of Union, 100 Irish MPs sit in London. Irish bishops of the Church of Ireland, not Catholic bishops, sit. The Church of Ireland is the Anglican Church in Ireland. Sit in the House of Lords. Irish lords sit in the House of Lords. And in the course of so Ireland is, by the 1820s, fully integrated into the new United Kingdom. There's a single currency. In 1829, the last restrictions on Catholic participation in British political life, except for at the monarchical level, are dissolved. So you still can't have a Catholic king of England, but you can have, after 1829, a Catholic basically anything else. There's a single market, a single currency, free movement. Ireland and England are one unit, but the remains of that colonial relationship are still there. So Ireland is still governed by a Lord Lieutenant, who is a kind of executive appointed in London with powers that are, there are Lords Lieutenant in all of the English counties, but they don't have powers like they have in Dublin. There are still lots of British Army regiments stationed across Ireland. There's an instrument called the Coercion Act, which is intended to be a kind of piece of emergency legislation that allows the suspension of habeas corpus and other suspensions of civil liberties in the case of emergency. Those are used something like 17 times between 1801 and the famine. So the emergency legislation becomes routine. And Ireland remains within a kind of quasi-colonial relationship constitutionally, and it remains a major source of exported goods, especially agricultural goods, and rent in Britain. So that's a very, very long answer. But as I say, like, the past is always like that long history through the Middle Ages, the early modern era, the 18th century, all of that is weighing on the constitutional arrangement that Ireland and Britain find themselves in on the eve of the potato famine.
So there's a long history between Ireland and, let's just say, London, England, not indigenous to Ireland. The potato is actually indigenous to here, the Americas.
Yep. So the potato is part of what historians sometimes call the Columbian Exchange, which was a very unequal biological exchange of basically pathogens from Eurasia in exchange for highly useful food crops from the Americas. So the tomato, right? If you like this, like, so indelibly associated with Italy, right? The tomato is not indigenous to Italy; it's indigenous to the Americas. The potato, so indelibly associated with Ireland, with northern Germany. That with Poland, right? That is indigenous to the Americas. The potato
Funny how we think
becomes.
It is funny how we think about the potato in Ireland and Germany, and sort of as a European thing.
Yeah, but I mean, it's cultivated like it's Peruvian, right? Is really the first place where potatoes are systematically cultivated as a food crop. And their potatoes grow wild from Central America through northern, like the Andes and central Mexico, right? And so the potato becomes a staple crop. It becomes a kind of famine backstop in Europe. It's brought over by Spanish and Portuguese conquistadors after the first contact, or the first kind of like cataclysmic arrival of European disease and European ambition in the Americas. And then it's introduced gradually to Ireland. There's all kinds of legends about it being introduced by like Sir Walter Raleigh or Sir Francis Drake, and nobody really knows who did it. I mean, I think the most plausible account is that it was brought to Ireland by Basque fishermen from northern Spain, or from northern Basque country, who are, stopped in Ireland for fresh water, on their way to the Grand Banks off the coast of what's now Newfoundland. So they would stop for potato anyway, and it started out as a kind of backstop against the failure of other crops in Ireland. But as this process of increasing colonialism in the 18th century picked up speed, the potato became more and more a staple crop rather than a fallback crop. And so Irish farmers, peasants who might have been, first of all, they sort of ceased to be peasants because there was no, like, small holdings became, people stopped being smallholders and became rent paying tenants, often on very small plots of land. And on those small plots of land, right, the pressure of rent increased as the population of Ireland increased, as the demands of the British export market increased, land became more and more subdivided. And potatoes emerged as a solution to the problem of an export-oriented economy that was supposed to produce both food products for export and also rent for landlords, but at the same time didn't have a lot of capital investment, had this Catholic population who were considered to be, if not like on the fringes of civilization at best by many British observers. And so potatoes were a subsistence crop that made possible a very sophisticated, and throughout the 18th and 19th century, increasingly sophisticated, increasingly integrated export market. And so the potato became the symbol of Ireland, in part because the Irish came to depend on it in order to survive the rigors of the imperial economy, and then after the Act of Union, the rigors of the economy of the Union.
This is Letters in Politics, and we are in conversation with Padraic X. Scanlan, Associate Professor at the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources at the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto. He is the author of the book Rot, an Imperial History of the Irish Famine. So this is a story of capitalism. I couldn't help, you pointed out earlier, and I was thinking about this when I was preparing for our conversation. When I'm thinking about the potato in Ireland, I couldn't help but think of sugarcane in the Caribbean and Haiti and that history there.
Yeah, I mean, that's, in some ways I spent the first part, I wrote, previous to Rot, 2 books about British slavery and anti-slavery, and about the transition from enslaved to free labor in the British Caribbean, and about the origins and politics of anti-slavery in Britain itself. And there are some, like, in some ways there are similarities, right? It just in terms of the extraction, not in terms of the labor. Because one of the things about plantation labor and slave labor in the British Caribbean is that it is unbelievably capital intensive. It relies on what historians sometimes and abolitionists call the chattel principle, right? The idea that enslaved people could be exchanged at any time for money, that they were themselves kind of units of capital that appreciated or depreciated, could always be exchanged, had basically no value, like were there to be sold, right? And that saleability was of a piece with the overall capitalization of the Caribbean economy. So to set up a sugar plantation, there's a historian, I think it's the historian John McNeill, who said, like, a sugar plantation is an incredibly energy and money intensive way of turning sunlight into money, right? So you need lots of money to set up a plantation, lots of capital, but in the end, right, the plantations extract, right? They extract sugar, and they extract the revenues from all of the many, many, many other industries, financial industries, insurance industries, commercial industries that are associated with the sugar economy. So in that sense, in the 18th century, right, as the sugar economies of the Caribbean are booming, Ireland is being subjected not to the same kinds of, like, categorically untrue, and I think in some ways is sometimes used by members of the Irish diaspora to kind of launder their own racism, right? They say like, well, we overcame slavery, right? But the Irish weren't enslaved, right? They were enslaved by the Vikings, but not in a like in a very different kind of system than that's not what Irish people usually mean, or Irish diaspora people usually mean when they say we were the first slaves. They don't mean of the Vikings, right? They mean of the British Empire. So that didn't happen. So Ireland didn't have slavery. It had a free labor economy, but it was similarly, and it didn't have a lot of capital. In fact, it was systematically starved of capital. So the Irish labor force were wage laborers, but they're among the lowest paid wage laborers in the British Empire. And Ireland was producing something for the British economy. And so in that sense, the Caribbean and Ireland, these two, it was inevitable that people would draw comparisons between them. And those comparisons intensified after emancipation in the British Caribbean. Because after formerly enslaved people became wage laborers in the British Caribbean, then all of a sudden, political economists in Britain started to see the recently emancipated sugarcane plantation worker being paid a pittance as being sort of civilizationally equivalent to the Irish peasant farmer surviving on potatoes, raising pigs for money, and both kind of like intractable, both in need of discipline, both unlikely to recognize the sort of values of the emerging Victorian bourgeoisie, right, of accumulation, of wage dependence, of work ethic, right? So in that sense, there are a lot of parallels, but I just like this is another kind of long-winded answer because I wanted to make sure that I sort of parsed out the fact that people are not comparing Irish laborers to enslaved laborers, but they are comparing the position of Ireland within the empire as an island producing stuff for Britain to the position of the Caribbean. Except the Caribbean is vastly more valuable, and in many ways much less troublesome. There are spectacular slave rebellions on the eve of emancipation, but in some ways, like rebellion, I think for many administrators of the British Caribbean, rebellion is seen as the price of such a profitable imperial possession. Right. And Ireland, it's not always clear, I think, to British administrators what Ireland actually contributes to Britain. But we can talk more about that if it's interesting.
I want to ask about this. In 1845, again, I guess it's a fungus that comes and attacks these potatoes. It causes the potatoes to rot late in the growing cycle, my understanding is, which I imagine is devastating because you think it's all going good, and then at the very end, you have this rotted potato in the ground that you can't rely on. This wasn't a fungus that was just unique to Ireland. This was all through Europe, and it was devastating to Europe, but nothing like it was in Ireland.
That's right. Yeah. So it's a fungus-like water mold. So it behaves like a fungus, but mycologists would, and certainly people who saw it under microscopes in the 1840s thought that it looked very much like a fungus. It has certain differences, which frankly, I'm not entirely clear on myself, but that are of significance to mycologists. So it like the potato is native to places where potatoes grow wild. But unlike in, say, the Central Valley, the central kind of volcanic valleys outside of Mexico City, which some plant geneticists think is the kind of point of origin of P. infestans, the organism that causes late blight. There's a lot more or at least at the time, right? There's a lot more genetic diversity amongst potatoes because there are potatoes that are grown systematically by farmers, but there are also potatoes that grow wild, and that genetic diversity makes the plants more resilient in the face of pathogens. It's also a drier climate, and water molds like P. infestans thrive. It's a bit sort of contradictory because not all water molds thrive in wet conditions, but this one does. And so, like in some ways, the conditions for the flourishing of this organism were better in wetter parts of Western Europe than they were in the Americas. But yeah, this organism it still is a major problem for potato agriculture. It's now prevented with the application of fungicides and compounds like copper sulfate, which is generally used as a fungicide in a lot of agricultural industries. But it's still really, really expensive. You'll still find potatoes that have been blighted, right? If you cut open a potato and it's got a hole in the middle and the hole is kind of like eaten out, it's either been eaten by a pest or it's been being consumed by P. infestans or a similar organism. And it strikes late in the growing season. So in Ireland, potatoes are, potatoes are stored underground. They're stored in pits that are dug in the ground during the harvest, at least at this time. They're lined with ash or with straw, and the potatoes are piled in on top of them, and you put dirt on top, and that stores the potatoes pretty well. But one of the most insidious features of late blight for Ireland was that it strikes not just potatoes buried in the ground. So you imagine, right, farmers digging up their potatoes and finding their whole fields destroyed. And in some ways, it wasn't that a surprise because late blight strikes the entire plant. So you could see the whole field, these kind of fields of potatoes just dying. It spreads really quickly. To this day, right, the Irish Weather Service in the Irish Republic provides like a blight forecast for farmers of the relative sporulation of this organism to tell them when to apply fungicides and when not. And strikes late in the growing season, and it strikes potatoes buried in the ground. And so, when the potato crop was destroyed, imagine not just the crop itself, but stuff that had already been unearthed, right? So in October of 1845, right, people knew when they dug up their potatoes, these potatoes are dead. Right. And that would be pretty late in the harvest, October, November. People would start digging up their potatoes in August. But then they go in November to break open a pit of potatoes that they buried in August and find that they've been blighted too. And so that was the thing that was one of the features of the organism and the features of the pathogen that made the late blight especially devastating, is that it destroyed both growing and stored potatoes.
And this obviously brings in a famine because they're so dependent now on the potato, but you also write it's not that there's not any other crops in Ireland, but they're being forcibly used as exports.
And not and not even forcibly, right? It's not, I think there's this like the principle of rent is so like that's one of the points I try to make throughout the book.
What do you mean what do you mean by rent? I mean, like
I mean literal rent on land. So the Irish, one of the points I try to make in Rot is that the Irish economy looks old because it's low technology, it's low capital, and Ireland is still, it's still like rural Ireland is incredibly picturesque, right? It looks old. It looks like stepping back in time, the kind of like stone hedgerows and undulating fields, and you can still see like in some fields the kind of wave of potato lazy bed cultivation, as it's called, these kind of very like Iron Age, Roman Age method of growing tubers in pits that are anyway. But in fact, the economy is extremely modern, and it is capital poor, but it is capitalistic, definitely. And so Ireland is owned by a relatively small number of people who are not entirely, but mostly Protestant, and who are not entirely, but predominantly landlords who acquired their land in the wake of the 17th century conquests. And a lot of those landlords don't live in Ireland. There are exceptions. Some landlords are good. Or better than others. But because Ireland doesn't have a lot of capital and it doesn't have the kinds of people who in England would be called farmers. So if you hear the word farmer in 18th century or 19th century England, don't imagine sort of a rustic, I mean, they might be a rustic person, but this is somebody with money. Because in England, farmers rent land on long-term leases from aristocrats and often pool their capital with aristocrats to improve the land, and then hire laborers to manage it and professional managers to manage it. And sometimes these farms are 1,000, 2,000 acres in size. They're really substantial industries. In Ireland, they're much smaller, in part because people don't have money. Like there's just much less capital in the Irish economy. And so farms are smaller, and but rents are not connected. Like the rent that smaller farmers, imagine somebody renting, say, 50 acres of land instead of 1,000, right? That land, the rent is not connected to what the land can produce. The rent is connected to what the market will bear and what people will pay. It floats free of the actual produce of the land. And so rents in the 18th century start to climb up, and I mean, they're comparatively low compared to England, but compared to the productivity of Irish land, they're very high. And so Irish land is chopped up into smaller and smaller pieces, and it becomes a kind of like a pyramid scheme in a way, although there is ultimately an underlying asset that's being the like agricultural produce, where landlords at the top, aristocratic landlords at the top, collect rent from smaller farmers who collect rent from smaller farmers who collect rent from people who are called conacre farmers, who rent as sometimes as little as an acre or less of land, basically just to grow potatoes for subsistence, who themselves sometimes rent a cottage to people who are even lower. So this is an economy where everybody is a landlord of some kind. Everybody is collecting rent from someone else, and all that money is flowing upward. And those rents are not at all connected to the productivity of the land, but to the market itself. And as the population of Ireland grows, the pressure on land increases and rents increase. And the potato makes it possible to survive in this economy because it grows pretty well. It can offer big yields in small amounts of land.
The miracle.
And it is, but yeah, and you can survive. Like a diet of potatoes and water is not entirely nutritionally adequate, but it kept a lot of Irish people alive. Millions of people alive. So it clearly is, it's without, it's lots of vitamins in potatoes. Like it's not stealth marketing from the potato lobby, but they are they're nutritionally rich foods. And so, right, like, so this made it possible, like people couldn't eat the other stuff that they grew. So if you were somebody who was a conacre farmer, you ate potatoes. And for wages, you usually would work on a bigger farm, where you would sell a pig, or you would work for a grazier, like milking or herding cows, or cutting grass, and you would be paid either in a small amount of wages or in land for potatoes, and you would not actually consume any of the things that you produced on the farms that you worked on. So you have the situation where people would, like 90 million eggs were being exported on the eve of the famine from Ireland to England or to Britain, but many Irish people, not all Irish people, but the people who are like very poor and had chickens wouldn't eat any of the eggs their chickens laid. They would sell them. And so they just survived. So the potato was the kind of like the lubrication of this extraordinarily exploitative economy, that made it possible for people, and people like couldn't break free of it. Because they had to make their rent or they'd be evicted. And if they were evicted, they would have to leave or they would die. And so, they were in a situation where the potato made it possible to survive from season to season, and sometimes made it possible to survive with a very generous and adequate supply of food. So you didn't have to worry about food, but you always had to worry about rent.
I wonder, I've heard it said that what was happening generally in Europe with potato, because again, this affects large everyone, and that this might have been one of the driving forces that led to the revolts and the revolutions in 1848. Do you get a revolt in Ireland at all against how this is working out, or are you? And it could be beyond this as well. But I'm also wondering, when you're in a famine, a serious famine, and things are so desperate, is it even possible to revolt in that kind of thing?
So there is a lot of violence in the famine, that's localized. So one of the programs that the UK government introduces in Ireland, it spends a lot of money on for very little effect, is a program of public works. And the public works wages are paid in cash. But one of the things that the commissioners have to do when they send out the money to pay the wages is they send out 3 identical coaches, because there's so many robberies of the coaches and there's so many robberies of potato shipments, of grain shipments, of steamships, right? There's a lot of violence in the potato famine, but it's not revolutionary violence. There are a group, however, of Irish intellectuals. One of them is a pretty prominent parliamentarian named William Smith O'Brien, who are part of the early Irish nationalist movement, which is called the Repeal movement. And the Repeal movement is strongly associated with one of the great heroes of 19th century Irish history, Daniel O'Connell, the emancipator, they call him, because he led the campaign for Catholic emancipation. in the late 1820s. And Daniel O'Connell, though, is a very strict traditionalist Catholic. He's extremely religious, and in many ways, he's a small c conservative. He's not a member of the Conservative Party, and he's for the repeal. So he doesn't want Ireland to achieve, he's not looking for a republic. He wants Ireland to be restored to its parliament, what they call the Parliament of 1783. So a parliament that is independent but under the British Crown. An independent kingdom under a single monarch, a repeal of the Union. But within the repeal movement, there are a group of intellectuals, some of whom are Catholic, some of whom are Protestant, but many of whom are strongly influenced by the Romantics. Many of them are also strongly influenced by Thomas Carlyle. They love Carlyle. They call him Tom in their letters. I'm fascinated by Carlyle. I'd like to one day, I think, write a kind of biography of his influence in the 19th century. But they are more secular. And one of the kind of dividing lines, sorry, again, it's always the weight of history on this past. One of the dividing lines in Ireland that starts to split, and in some ways it's quite clever on the part of Robert Peel's Conservative government in the United Kingdom, is to propose a series of secular universities for Ireland that what will be called the Queen's Colleges. And they still exist. University College Cork, University College Galway, like these were kind of the major cities, because there was already Trinity College in Dublin, which was the Anglican college of long standing in Dublin, and then there's Maynooth, what's now Maynooth University, what was then St. Patrick's, I think, college, which was a Catholic seminary. And so, by proposing this legislation to introduce these secular universities, it creates a split in the repeal movement, where the people who become known as the Young Irelanders propose a kind of more romantic nationalism on the model of the kind that's being promoted on the continent in Europe, the kind that motivates the revolutions of 1848. And they're even called Young Ireland as a kind of insult at first, as akin to Young Italy, but they adopt it as their badge, right? They are Young Ireland. And in 1848, just after the most brutal year of the famine, the Young Irelanders, after, because of a wave of violence in the wake of the famine, Britain increases its coercive powers. Like, it introduces a Coercion Act. It starts shutting down Irish nationalist newspapers. It starts arresting nationalists. And in response, the Young Irelanders declare rebellion. And at first, it looks like, and this is something I look at, I kind of try to narrate in Rot. At first, there are these reports in the British press that, like, Kilkenny has fallen, right? Cork is going to fall, right? Then, and in the pantheon of the later Irish revolutionaries and nationalists, like, Cork is like the seat, and Kilkenny are these like kind of heartlands of republicanism. And, they have that kind of reputation, or that reputation doesn't come to fruition at this time, right? Because the Young Irelanders march there. They think they have like some armed followers. They think they're going to be able to raise a kind of general peasant rebellion, but it doesn't happen. And the only battle of the 1848 rebellion happens at a farmhouse in the countryside in the south of what's now the Republic of Ireland, where a group of police officers take shelter inside of a farmhouse. They have guns. The people outside don't have many guns. But they move to set fire to the house from the outside. The police shoot one of the people outside, and the crowd disperses. And that's it. The Young Ireland to William Smith O'Brien is sent to the Australian penal colonies, where he's received as a hero. And he ends up returning later to England, where he's pardoned. Right. So in a certain sense, like, a lot of the revolutionaries of 1848 in Ireland continue in some ways. Some of them leave political life afterwards. Some of them go to the United States. And in the United States, some of them become involved with the Fenian Brotherhood, which becomes the kind of secret underground organization that's associated with the emerging Irish Republican Brotherhood, which is one of the ancestors of the Irish Republican Army. And so you end up with people in the American Civil War. There's a guy whose surname is Mahar. I can't remember his first name. Mahar of the Sword is what he was called. And he's an officer in the Union Army. And then there are other members of Young Ireland who are Confederate, like virulently pro-slavery Confederate propagandists. So there is an 1848 chapter there, but in some ways it's kind of like, it shows, you can see more clearly what the way that the experience of the revolutions of 1848 inspired Irish intellectuals and politicians more than you can see the way that the forces at work on the continent were at work in Ireland.
Would the famine then forever be one of the motivational drivers for Irish independence?
That's a good question. And I am one that it's definitely profoundly symbolic, and it's certainly very, very important for the diaspora. The experience of famine, the experience, I was just back, I'm from Montreal. I was just back in Montreal. There's a monument underneath the Victoria Bridge, ironically, underneath the Victoria Bridge, erected by Irish laborers who dug the Lachine Canal, in Montreal, to 6,000 people who perished on the ships coming over. They call them the coffin ships, right? So these are steamships where people with typhus, which flourishes. A lot of people who died in the famine died of typhus, right? In some ways, it was a mass epidemic of typhus, which afflicts. Like it's a dangerous disease if you're well, but it spreads really well in very close kind of filth, like dirty conditions, as basically digested flea feces, like becomes aerosolized and you inhale it and becomes epidemic typhus. So they died of typhus on these ships, and they were commemorated. There's another garden in Toronto, the Famine Garden on Erin Quay, which itself, right? And they use the spelling, the traditional, like the Irish spelling, which is now where Billy Bishop Airport is, right? A hero of the Royal Air Force. So there's all these, like, there's this complex relationship of empire and colony going on. But people in the diaspora certainly saw the famine. It was their founding trauma, right? And in some ways, it motivated the support among people in the diaspora for what became the revolutionary struggle in Ireland. But whether or not, and like for Irish nationalists and for Irish revolutionaries, the hunger strike was one of the most powerful symbolic weapons. And I can't help but feel that it's meant in some ways to invoke the experience of the famine. Although it's also, I think, meant in some ways to force the British to kind of expose the cracks in the ideology of civilization that motivated so much of British imperialism in the 19th century, right? Like, you have these scenes in the great Irish hunger strikes of the 20th century of force feedings, right? This kind of really torture-like or torturous experience of violent, violating experience of force feeding, but it's in the name of not allowing people to die because the British Empire doesn't allow its subjects to die, right? Or like protects them. And there's this weird dimension there. But like the proximate causes of the Irish Revolution in 1916 are much like they're set in motion in part by the famine, but like the land war of the 1860s and 1870s, when the aristocratic landlord class were, they're like land is really the thing that underwrites a lot of Irish revolutionary activity. And the famine motivates the diaspora and like it makes the diaspora inclined to support the struggle in Britain. And the famine is obviously there for Irish revolutionaries, but there are a lot more proximate causes. So, I mean, in some ways, and I try to bring this out in Rot as well, like the history of Irishness is in some ways a history of the famine, because a lot of the stereotypes about Irishness that are now kind of like what St. Patrick's Day just passed, right? A lot of the kind of like stereotypes of like the episode of The Simpsons where it's the St. Patrick's Day parade and like everyone's drunk and fighting. And the Irish certainly drank and fought, but so did the British in the 19th century. And the stereotype of the Irish at the era of the famine was of kind of like almost like a simian peasant, right? Like who was wearing sort of like an old ratty stovepipe hat and old evening, like just like patched up, filthy evening clothes, and was kind of like lying and cheating and constantly like work shy. And that was the stereotype. So the stereotype of like the Irish drunk or like the Irish cop or the Irish firefighter or the Irish ward healer, right? Or corrupt politician, right? Those are all diasporic inventions. And in some ways, Irishness, there's two Irishnesses now, one that's in Ireland and that is motivated by Ireland's 20th century history and its relationship to the EU and its continuing relationship to the United Kingdom and Brexit. And then there's another sense of Irishness that in some ways like like they broke apart. The famine broke those two, like the famine broke those two pathways apart, and they've diverged. And every St. Patrick's Day they meet. And one of the reasons why I worked so, have this like insanely Irish name, and one of the reasons why I didn't do anything to do with Ireland for a long time in my career is partly out of a sort of like kind of like discomfort that with that kind of like like long distant Irishness, right? Like when I, like Joe Biden, right, identifying himself as Irish. And like, I'm about as Irish as Joe Biden, you know what I mean? In the sense that neither of us is really Irish, right? But our one side of our family has roots associated with the potato famine, has Catholicism, right? That's still there. Some of it, but like this is like a diasporic identity. And so like one of the things that was interesting in Rod is figuring out where I stood in relationship to that identity.
You also write about the major impact that the famine has on Irish folk tales, both in Ireland and in the diaspora. Talk to me about that. That's interesting.
Yeah. Oh, I loved that was my favorite. I think my favorite part of the research for the book was working with and with a research assistant through one of the, I wish I knew Irish properly. And I think if I have a minute, I would like to, like, probably never acquire the fluency necessary to read these records in Irish. But I'm sure there's a much even richer history that could be written with the Irish language sources from the folk collections. But in the wake of Irish independence, and when it was still the Irish Free State, a government program in the 1930s, like not school children and our professional folklorists were employed in parallel to collect Irish folk memories. And so it's pretty cute, right? They basically across Ireland.
That's interesting because I always think at that time, I didn't realize there was one for Irish stories because there was also a similar program, the New Deal, to get the stories of formerly enslaved people who were still alive.
Yeah, I would wonder, I don't know, but I would bet that there's a certain kind of like, and this is at a time when folklore is emerging as a more kind of solid academic discipline. But basically, it's pretty cute, right? The idea was they got Irish school children to interview old people about all kinds of stuff. And so you can see it. It's completely available online if you want to look through it. A lot of it's been transcribed, although even like the handwriting is very legible and quite adorable. Like it's like kids sort of school cursive. And it's called the Schools Collection. It's searchable if you're interested in looking at it. It's got folk tales and folk stories and folk memories arranged by subject. And one of the things that I looked into was potato cultivation, but also the famine. And a lot of the people who were reporting these stories were, if they were alive during the famine, were very, very young, like children, and probably don't remember it. So you're really getting the folk memory of the famine rather than the recollection of people who lived through it. And in it, you can see some of the, you can interpret through it some of the features of those memories of the famine repeat, right? There's lots of stuff about eating, as you can imagine, eating grass, eating money. There's lots of kind of just so stories of like a virtuous woman who, in order to keep her to kind of make her children who are starving feel better, boils a pot of rocks. But then when she empties the pot of rocks into the basket that they used to drain the potatoes, it's actually brand new potatoes and they have a feast. There's stories of people who, and this is actually a legend of the famine, that's what's called superism, right? The idea that there were a substantial number of Catholics who, in exchange for food, converted to Protestantism. They took the soup. And there certainly were Protestant missionaries in Ireland. It's not clear to what extent they were offering that kind of cruel of a quid pro quo, but in the folk memory, and I think it was pretty unlikely actually, like most missionaries were not, like, what they were doing was not was in many ways like toxic and destructive, but they themselves were not like you don't usually get people who are like cruel martinets who become missionaries to the very poor in Ireland, right? They're trying to convert people to Protestantism, but it's definitely not convert or you die, for the most part. And maybe there's some bad actors, but superism in the folk memory becomes really widespread. And so you have these stories of a woman, one of them that we found in the archives, is like a woman who converts to Protestantism, and then as she dies, like a moth flutters and 6 candles go out in her room. And it's this portentous moment. So there's this kind of, I think you can see the trauma of the famine being digested in these folk stories, but they're not necessarily reliable guides to the actual events of the famine. Although sometimes they're evocative. So one of the things, there are still in Ireland these kind of like famine walkways, which were basically like they're tourist attractions now, and often in very remote parts of the country, where there's sort of on the side of a mountain or a hill, there's a really well maintained wooden walkway that lets you climb up to the top. And some of those were built as make work projects in the famine. There are also, but in famine, and a lot of the work that people did on public works was not productive. Like it was mostly just to do something. But in the folk memory, it's people dug holes and filled them up again, right? Or you have, misers. There's all these stories of misers. Like they're really rich. That they're really like they're fascinating sources, and they really give you a sense of the profound rupture of the famine. And it would be interesting, and it's kind of unfortunate that there wasn't a similar project among members of the diaspora, to see how those. So there are some like folk memories in my own family that I've integrated into the book. Like they're again attenuated. It's been 4 generations since since like my father's great grandparents emigrated to Canada, but there's still this idea that people who spell their name Scanlan with an O instead of an A. Too, because my name is spelled with 2 A's. But if you spell it with 1 O, Scanlan with an O, those are supers. And like that O is like it's like the mark of Cain. And even if you're back to being Catholic, the fact you have an O in your name, and I don't know if any other Scanlans believe this. If they're listening, maybe it would be interesting. But in my family, that was like something that people said. And so, there's these kinds of like family legends that build up too, that give a sense of the profound rupture of the famine, but are not necessarily very useful guides to the actual events of the famine.
Yeah, like my mom's maiden name, Bogan. The story we tell is that we had to drop the O, which I guess is a common thing, but I don't even know if that's really true or not, and no one in my family probably really knows if that's true or not.
And I mean, it's also filtered through, I think a lot of people who are like find there's a kind of genealogical stop in Ireland, right? So a lot of people will say, if they're interested in and one of the things that motivated me to write this book is both my parents died in pretty short order, from 2019 through 2021. And my brother did a bit of sort of genealogical research, and it was interesting to see like another that you can see in the records, like if you look at ancestry.com, right, people will say, oh, our family are from Waterford, right? Or our family are from Westport, right? Or our family are from Cork. But often the places that those people are from, there's a kind of point where it stops, right? And that's actually where people embarked either for Liverpool to go across the Atlantic or directly across the Atlantic. So like Waterford is just a major port in the south of Ireland. So I'm sure there are a lot of people who believe, you know what I mean? Like the port cities become a part of the mythology, but there's a way in which the moment of leaving Ireland marks what happens before looks clear when you're looking at like a census record on your ancestry account. But at the same time, like unless your family have some money in Ireland, as the Scanlans did not, which explains why they ended up in Quebec instead of anywhere else. Not there's anything wrong with like a proud Quebecois, but there's that kind of erasure, right? And so people are eager, and I understand why, are eager to find an Irish identity that to sort of understand how they ended up in North America or in Australia. And some people in Australia can say with pride, right? Like, and they can track that, like my ancestor was transported here. You know what I mean? Like there's the sense of in Australia, the Australian Irish community, right, where a lot of Irish in Australia were transported as convicts to Australia, and where Australia has kind of transformed its convict past from what would have been deeply shameful in the early 19th century to being a point of pride, right? In the 21st century, if you can trace your ancestry in Australia back to a convictry, like that gives you a certain kind of like association with the founding, at least of European Australia, although another association with the the destruction of Indigenous Australia.
Yeah, which is another part of this story. I want to go back to a phrase you said earlier because it stuck out to me. Took the soup, and this is when somebody would convert from Catholicism to Protestantism in order to get some food. Was that a phrase that was used? That this person took this?
Yeah. Yeah, and superism, it was, so superism had a
When you
kind
say
of,
when you say superism, you mean soup.
yes, yeah, it would be like superism, like SOUPERISM. Yeah, so superism would be like and that was used before as a kind of all-purpose. It became used as a kind of all-purpose epithet for sort of collaboration. But yeah, people who took the soup or were alleged to have taken the soup, right? There's this one person, there's this one story again in the school's collection of folklore of someone who decides, you know what, it's worth it, and he says like like Godine, right? So the Irish anglicized Irish diminutive of adding like Colleen for a girl. You know, like goodbye Gaudine until the Praties grow again, right? So it's like someone's like, well, you know what? Like I'll reconcile with the church when I'm not at risk of starving to death, right? So sometimes it's played for laughs, right? It's sometimes like and this is meant as kind of like a sort of humorous folktale, but it's also something that became, especially after the famine, as sectarianism in Ireland, which was always present, right? This is always a religiously riven society. But after the famine, Catholicism became associated much more closely with nationalism. Whereas, like the Catholic League, led by Daniel O'Connell, were nationalists, but they weren't Republicans. And in fact, they were very much, as we said before, like small c conservatives who wanted an agrarian Catholic Ireland that would be peaceful, and in a kind of peaceful coexistence with Britain as a independent sister kingdom. And after the famine, like and especially after the land war and the like the sectarian violence gets more and more, and sectarianism gets more and more intense and becomes more and more politicized, right? These are like, as Catholic praxis declines, Catholic association with nationalism and Catholicism as a political identity and Protestantism as a political identity becomes much more prominent in Ireland. And that's where you get like, you took the soup, right? As like and as a kind of like a deep stain on your and like people have long memories, certainly. So it's in Ireland, especially people who stay. So if you had an ancestor who took the soup or who converted, that's probably something that people remember. Like one of the things I found while researching the book, especially looking at cases of eviction, which I used court records to get at, is how like within this economy of transactional contractual relationships of rent paying, there are lots and lots and lots of much more complex customary and emotional ties. So every lease, every farm, every cottage is bound up both in is like connected by a pretty easily severed legal tie, and you sever that tie and everyone gets evicted. But at the same time, those evictions and the proceedings surrounding them reveal just how deeply everything else is connected. And so people remember, right? And that's one of the things that makes superism into this this kind of indelible stain later on in the 19th century.
It's a pejorative.
Yes, exactly.
Padraic X. Scanlan has been our guest. Padraic Scanlan is Associate Professor at the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources at the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto. He has joined us for a conversation about his book. It's called Rot, an Imperial History of the Irish Famine. Padraic Scanlan, that was really interesting, and I thank you for taking this time.
Thank you very much.